on monitoring vaccine safety, let us now welcome Dr. Suzette Lazo.
Afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me today. So, change of pace from the infections, we will now talk about vaccines. Okay. I was given the task of focusing on three objectives, which includes describing the steps in the licensing of vaccines. Secondly, to discuss the importance of monitoring vaccine safety, pre- and post-licensure, and to discuss the safety of mass vaccination programs. So let me take you, as a way of a review perhaps, of how vaccines come to be and the changing world that we now find itself in trying to handle this very precious medical marvel. Okay, let me give you an overview of vaccine research and development, all through manufacturing and licensing. You see the red-orange bar that shows you the timeline of development from the research phase onwards through the early development phase, the late development phase, and the registration phase. You have the number of years below that bar, and the red line will also show you the importance of manufacturing. The early research phase integrates many disciplines, specifically molecular biology, medicine, pharmacology, and all the other sciences in trying to do the initial finding of the antigen that will work against the target disease. As you can see, it's very possible to, thank you, it's very possible to probably invent or come up with vaccines against many diseases. But if you look at the lowermost bar, the cost is immense. And there has to be a balance between the economic incentives that will be required to have a return on the investment. So, specifically, development will be divided into the preclinical phase and the clinical phase, because the ultimate question before licensing is to answer the question of safety and efficacy in a new vaccine candidate. So from the preclinical explorations of looking for the antigen, looking at its immunogenicity function, because as you know, vaccines work by stimulating the immune system, and looking at initial safety studies. If all goes well, it then proceeds into the clinical phase. Let me see if I can. Okay, never mind this. Anyway, you can see on the board. And the late development phase constitutes part of the clinical phases, which is phase 1. I'm sure many of you have listened to lectures before on drugs, and this is very similar. Okay? Phase 1 studies, which will involve initially normal adult volunteers. In vaccine trials now, if phase 1 trials proceed as expected and hoped, it then goes into phase 2 trials. Okay. It then goes into phase 2 trials, which might even include children of the age group having the target disease. So those ranging studies are done here. The initial posology studies involving vaccines, which is to look at the effect of those on the immunogenicity, because ultimately you will have to have a dosing schedule. Now, if results are favorable, it goes into what we call the pivotal studies, because this now involves bigger sample sizes of patients that will provide the data for evidence of efficacy and safety. Now, if the results of phase 3 trials are favorable, the licensing review will be done. Of course, the whole data from the beginning will be reviewed. And if it is found acceptable, that means it complies with safety and efficacy parameters, it will be licensed. This particular data on the 1 billion point is based on 2010 data. So probably, if you go by the 8 to 10% increase, it will cost more than 1 billion, as seen here. Okay. The clinical trials are very critical because that forms, again, what is known as the pivotal requirements to prove that the vaccine works. That means it's effective and that it is safe. And since smallpox and all the vaccines that have come to be, we have about 100 years, we have become more sophisticated, including in the clinical trials. And we now have a lot of guidelines that have a global scope, such as the ICH, which after 20 years now has a revision. This is a very successful guideline because it harmonizes the global studies so that you probably can see there are also more clinical trials worldwide now compared to 20 years ago. Vaccines are special, and so they do comply with ICH's provisions, but in addition, they also have other peculiarities, and I have already mentioned the immunogenicity aspect of clinical trials. And there are, again, guidelines that will be used in clinical trials involving vaccines. If we go back to the preclinical phase, you can see that the immunogen identification is a very critical aspect. And until the 1980s, when we had the first recombinant vaccine, the hepatitis B vaccine, before that, vaccine was sort of a very relaxed aspect of medicine because we only had DPT and polio, and it involved mainly children. But now, with the dawn of the molecular biology era, we suddenly have an explosion of so many vaccines in the horizon, which involves practically all ages. Also, we're going into the era where probable therapeutic vaccines will come about. Prevention of cancer is already a reality with the HPV vaccine. Okay. So, the clinical phase, again, is very important to have the licensing approval. And this particular schematic diagram is based on a US data because you have the biologic license application, no, which we do not have. So, in the Philippines, the data involves, of course, the preclinical and the clinical for approval of a vaccine. And it also gives more confidence if a vaccine has pre-approval in a reference country like the United States and EU. Vaccines are also special because, unlike drugs, after license approval, there are also a special tests, no, because of the biological nature of vaccines, which means the production is not as straightforward as the conventional drugs. And so you have the so-called lot release testing, which will test for the purity, try to screen out the presence of contaminants like bacterial and fungal contaminants, and also further aspects like the pyrogenicity, because it involves the testing for the presence of fever-inducing substances. Okay, so we were talking. Lot release testing, no? And this is already a sort of a preview of the next era to come, which is the biological products, no? When we talk of conventional drugs, you have identical products coming out, no? That's why we have the generic formats. But when we are talking of biological products, it will have to be as close as possible. In other words, as similar as possible and not identical. Now, regulatory agencies are the gatekeepers of approval for vaccines. And it has the duty to ensure the availability of safe and effective medicines. It also has the responsibility to see to it that there is a sufficient supply of safe and effective vaccines. So not only to regulate, but to ensure the supply. And the evaluation of vaccines is guided by many partners that are ready to help us, specifically the World Health Organization, which publishes a wide range of guidelines on vaccines, including the clinical and non-clinical also evaluation of vaccine products. The Philippines, in turn, would adopt many of these guidelines that would help in its work. Okay. Before, vaccines had a lot of issues which we will discuss, but today I want to emphasize the fact that vaccines are much safer than ever. No? And it's because of better production, we have better quality, and also the discoveries of purer antigens, so you have safer vaccines. We also have better transport process. We know more about how vaccine behave, and that they are sometimes very temperature sensitive, so we have to guard that. And also we have better equipments. For instance, many years ago we didn't have disposable syringes, but today we do have those, and that will also redound to better infection control. Vaccines also have a wider range of formats, like orals and also the intranasals, and also the posology, which means the dose and also the immunologic, correlated with the immunologic response, so that we have a very good dosification in order to have the maximum immunological response. Then we also have better diagnostics. And of course, the science of pharmacovigilance has grown and has already matured more. And finally, there is standardization and harmonization in the whole world. This illustrates, for instance, that vaccines today actually are safer because you're exposing the children and other recipients to a fewer number of antigens compared to before. So that's why I'm sure everyone in this room will agree that the vaccines have done its work in saving lives by preventing disease. But this very strength has also become the weakness of vaccines, because this generation now of people have no experience in seeing, for instance, the ravages of diseases like smallpox or polio. And so they don't focus on the disease, but rather on the adverse reactions brought about by vaccines. So that becomes the focus, and they lose sight of the fact that if we don't give the vaccine, then the disease that we are trying to prevent will recur. And so this low tolerance makes us even more demanding of safer vaccinations because of this attitude now. And it's a proven fact that vaccines, of course, are extremely safe, but still, they're not absolutely safe, and risk is never zero. So in deciding whether to approve a vaccine for licensing, the regulatory body has to weigh that benefits must outweigh potential risk. And how does it do this? There are many ways to look at risk versus benefit. There are quantitative and qualitative measures. And there's a lot of debate, for instance, in using the quantitative measures, because for some, the advantages is almost equal to the disadvantages. But the trend now is using a qualitative descriptive approach, which has been adopted late in the second half of last year by the US FDA. And here you have the format where you have the decision factor, the analysis of the condition, current treatment options, benefits, risk, and risk management. No? And as weighed against the evidence and uncertainties and the conclusions. No? This particular trend towards using a descriptive benefit risk assessment is, I think, also going to involve the World Health Organization, the ICH, and EMA. And I'm happy to learn that our own regulatory has already participated in initial training sessions, no, to undertake the BRA, which is the assessment, the type of assessment. Secondly, we will now discuss the importance of monitoring vaccine safety pre- and post-licensure. Let me take you back on the premise of why vaccine safety monitoring is important. No matter that I said vaccines are extremely safe, no? Because vaccine adverse events have happened due to production error. In 1955, I think this is one of the biggest, the most important disaster, when Qatar laboratories marketed polio virus that was insufficiently inactivated, resulting in the infection of 120,000 children. No? During this time, when polio was beginning to be used, I think this was the biggest mass immunization in history. No? It involved millions of children. And unfortunately, there was this company that had a failure in activating or attenuating the polio virus. And so, because of this, there were laws that followed that became stricter. Earlier than that, there was something that happened also involving Bilibid prisons, inmates actually, who were given cholera vaccine contaminated with plague organisms because there was a contamination. No? The doctor involved invariably was exonerated because it seems there was someone who was in the laboratory who was very careless, causing the contamination. In 1930, similarly, there was a BCG vaccine that was given that was insufficiently inactivated and resulted in TB. So these are tragic stories that have happened. Now, we know, and I hope most of you have already seen the data, that there had been linkages between vaccine, like measles, and autism. And a few years ago, I think there was a lecture given that showed this has been thoroughly debunked. The same with other supposed to be linked correlation with thiomersal, the preservative in the vaccine, no, to cause some adverse reactions. Those are already shown to be untrue by a whole lot of data, no, including systematic reviews, large linked databases from countries like Denmark that keeps very good records. But there are very rare events, maybe 1 in 100,000 that happens, no? Much lower than SSPE, for instance, which has recently been shown to be more common than originally thought, no? So if you don't give measles vaccine, you have run a higher risk of SSPE. These rare adverse events include acute encephalopathy from whole cell pertussis vaccine, acute arthropathy from rubella vaccine, thrombocytopenia following measles virus containing vaccines, no? Guillain-Barré syndrome from the 1970s swine flu vaccine, no? And paralytic polio following live attenuated oral polio vaccine, which is why we are already shifting towards the injectable. Because when you pass that out in the environment, it's possible it can find its way into with people's food, and then there's an infection. No? And of course, anaphylaxis following receipt of vaccines containing proteins or gelatin. Now, these rare adverse events cannot be detected by the phase 3 trials that have been conducted because the power of this phase 3 trial is not sufficient to really detect very rare infections. There's a mathematical formula for that. And so we need to continue with post-licensure studies. That's why post-licensure surveillance or monitoring is necessary because we need to protect the health of the public and ultimately to preserve vaccine confidence. Okay? When you do clinical studies in phase 3, these are very controlled studies, and they only include a narrow range of patients, unlike in the population setting where you may have high-risk subpopulations of people with underlying medical conditions, maybe preterm infants. No? Secondly, post-licensure surveillance or monitoring will also be able to find out if there are incorrect practices not consistent with the recommended use of the vaccine that would increase the risk of using the vaccine. Surveillance, I decided to include this because it gives all the details. No? Monitoring or surveillance is not just looking now and then, no? But it is an ongoing, non-stop, systematic collection, analysis, interpretation, and dissemination of data regarding a health-related event for use in public health action to reduce morbidity and mortality and to improve health. When we're talking of this surveillance, we have to look at the entire landscape of vaccine safety. And it doesn't only involve reporting AEFIs. It is a whole range of processes that covers vaccine, no? From manufacturing, the lot release testing, the cold chain management, and best practices in storage, prescribing, dispensing, and disposal. Can you imagine if we are careless and just throw away used polio vials, no? Oral polio vaccine vials. So there is really a consequence to pay. You also look at practices involving safe injection. And we're looking at the pharmacovigilance aspect, which is the reporting and all the more active studies that I will be explaining in a while. We're looking at best practices in national immunization programs, best practices in your clinics for those who are vaccine providers. I think in the US, you have to be certified to be able to provide vaccines, no? And so you undergo a sort of inspection to look at your equipment and also look at your processes. That includes screening of patients and also record keeping. And more importantly, which I think we need to explore more, is communication. The way we communicate with parents, the stakeholders, with media, with the leaders of our country, so they will understand what vaccine really means in terms of the public health aspect. And here's another thing that you have to keep always at the back of your mind, because this is a reality. It involves drugs and vaccines, no? Last year, there were these 2 episodes in China and Indonesia. So we have to be vigilant, no? Because imagine, if you're giving fake vaccines, no? That is a tragedy. Then vaccine safety is important because we're looking at a crisis now of what we call the vaccine deniers all over the world. And there was a project which was conducted by the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Last year, they published the results, and this shows you the red are those who have a high percentage of people who doubt the importance of vaccines. And the highest is in Europe, France actually, no? And more developed countries have actually lower confidence in vaccine. The Philippines, we are among the best in terms of the highest confidence, no? Based on the questions, vaccines are important for children to have. Overall, I think vaccines are effective. Overall, I think vaccines are safe, and vaccines are compatible with my religious belief. So we're in the honor section, and I hope we will do our best to keep it that way, no? Because it's also very important in terms of saving ourselves, all of us, from vaccine-preventable disease. So let's look at vaccine safety monitoring. And this is now the reporting which measures the adverse events following immunization, or AEFIs, as it is called, because it is also important in monitoring trends, in guiding our program planning and implementation, in evaluating our public policy and public immunization programs, and prioritizing healthcare resources. And there are 3 types, no? Passive surveillance, active surveillance, and sentinel surveillance. The passive surveillance are the voluntary, spontaneous reporting that's done usually by health authorities, reported to an authority that accepts the reports. In our case, it's the regulatory agency, the FDA, because it is a member of the WHO global monitoring for drugs and vaccines, and all the reports that it gets goes to Uppsala. Of course, in passive surveillance, you do not have a denominator, but you can see trends. For instance, clusters of report might constitute a signal for something, and so that is an indication that further investigation should be done. And if there's reason to believe that there's trouble there, of course, we need to help those who have been affected by that AEFI. It is the least expensive method, and it's a good method because this is the method, for instance, that found out the thalidomide tragedy, no? So it was started with a spontaneous reporting. And then you can go deeper into more active studies if your hypothesis seems to support there is something serious going on. The limitations, of course, are the non-reporting, the underreporting. It's underrepresented, limited clinical detail, and in our country, we have a dearth of reports because of the fear of litigation. Active surveillance is more active, no, in terms of detecting cases or stimulating case reporting. It could involve a search for hospital records, laboratory reports, and discharge summaries. Of course, it's more labor-intensive and resource-intensive than the passive. But this is the kind of study that will have a denominator, so we will have data on what is the percentage, for instance, of certain adverse events happening in our country, which is important, no? Because we can compare it to vaccine information sheets that are provided, for instance, by the WHO. And that will validate whether we have a peculiarity in terms of our characteristics that may have a higher or a lower incidence of AEFI. Sentinel surveillance, I think, is a very interesting possibility for us. No? It involves selected groups and populations. And the population represents an entire group. And of course, you use standard case definitions and protocol based on the Brighton collaboration methodologies. Canada, for instance, has a consortium of, I think, several big hospitals in their provinces. No? So this link up together to get data, and there is denominator. This will also provide support for practitioners in a way. No? What should be reported? Temporal association with a vaccine. So the timing is important, as with pharmacovigilance involving drugs. No? And there is no clear cause at the time of reporting. CDC, and I think this is very important for every practitioner, including those who are in the national immunization programs, no? To have a reference, if you still don't, of expected adverse events. For instance, tetanus in any combination with DTaP, DTP, etc. The event and interval from vaccination, no? You have anaphylaxis or anaphylactic shock, 7 days, brachial neuritis, acute complications, sequela, etc. So I think you should have these on hand if you are providing vaccines, because it's also important to have on hand whatever emergency measures you need, no? Especially if you're holding clinic. No? Like anaphylaxis may be rare, but it still could happen. Because there are vaccine components that do cause reactions, and number one is the antigen. Number two are the adjuvants that will enhance the immunologic reaction. Third is the preservative, like thimerosal. Then you have stabilizers, antibiotics, and others. In this day and age, when our antigens are becoming more sophisticated, I think this is another reason why we need to pursue vaccine safety monitoring, no? Because we really have to cover the patients for whatever unknowns are down the road. I hope that this will not happen, no? But for instance, if you're talking of flaviviruses, you know, how many are they now? So what's the antigen based on a flavivirus? How will it affect the next infections, for instance? In our country, we do have the National AEFI Committee, which is mandated by law, specifically AO 2010, which are the guidelines in surveillance and response to adverse events following immunization. And this is now in the process of being reviewed and hopefully strengthened. The objectives would be to detect, correct, and prevent program errors. Although program errors is no longer used, as I will show you in a while, no? And identify problems with the vaccines. And maintain confidence, as already mentioned, and estimate rates of occurrence on AEFI in the local population. Okay. There is a new causality classification since 2013 from the WHO. And this is now the classification. The programmatic errors have disappeared. In its place, you have the vaccine product-related reaction and the vaccine quality defect-related reaction. You have the immunization error-related reaction. This one should be avoided, no? But sometimes they still happen. That's why training for providers of vaccines are being done also by the DOH, no? But this needs periodic strengthening. And also the anxiety-related reaction is now recognized, no? Especially in adolescents, the syncope that happens with certain vaccines. Then you have the indeterminate, the yellow, which is the temporal relationship consistent, but there is insufficient definitive evidence for vaccine-causing events, and also the other factors, no? See, there's a classification also considered as unclassifiable because of inadequate data. And this is our vulnerabilities in terms of our AEFI, no? Because we have very little access to laboratory parameters, for instance, no? And that should, I think, be looked at seriously, including post-mortem studies. One classification is also coincidental because they do happen, and it is this one. This manual is available for download free if you are interested. There's a lot of global support in terms of the technical and even the harmonization trends, for instance, when we look at terminologies that's happening. And here, for instance, is the Philippines. We have access to WHO, no? This is the Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety, and they do have bulletins that they issue on vaccines periodically. We have Brighton collaboration, which is standardizing terminologies so that we will understand one another no matter what part of the world we come from when we talk about our reports. And then, of course, you have the SIUMS group. You have also, this is Uppsala, no? The International Pharmaceutical International Drug Monitoring of the WHO. And then you have other partners like USA, EU. Of course, the USA has a lot of capability, and I hope it continues even under the new administration. They have, for instance, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a consortium of all the HMOs, the big HMOs in the US. So they have very complete patient data, and so you have a denominator. They're able to look at rare adverse events, no? They're able to catch rare adverse events because they have millions of patients. And what's important here, when you're doing vaccine safety studies, is to maintain patient confidentiality. And that's being safeguarded in their method. They always have another identifier for patients. Now, let's go into immunization programs. Again, to emphasize that vaccine really does work, and this beautiful infographic shows you and gives you a scope of the reduction in terms of the disease, no? Before and after. That's why we have to safeguard vaccines. Otherwise, there's a table that shows if you don't, the coverage goes down and then you get an outbreak. But to maximize the public health benefits, no, the coverage is essential, as this table shows, no? Because if you only have few people who are vaccinated in yellow, and there are people with the infection, you still get here people who will be able to catch the disease. If you have people who are vaccinated, there's fewer transmission. So vaccines' indirect effects has been shown. I think one recent data is the pneumococcal vaccine, which shows a correlated reduction in admissions in the elderly, with the use of pneumococcal vaccines for not only the elderly but also children. If we look at immunization in the Philippines, there are two sectors that delivers this vaccine. You have the public sector, notably our government, and you have the private sector, and you can see the variables here that are present. No? Of course, the provider, the source, you have methodologies like the cold chain, costing, screening process may differ, post-vaccine care may differ, AEFI incidence may differ. We don't know. We have no data as far as AEFI. For the reasons enumerated earlier, but just to show you this slide, because there's lots of room that we need to do research in, for instance. And both use the childhood immunization schedule, which is primarily the work of PIDSP together with our DOH. So thank you for this continuing dedication. And the childhood immunization schedule has been subject to question, especially in the US. It's been subject to question because parents concerned indicate that they think the combination might do more harm than good. Okay? So I'll just wind this up now. But there are data to show that, and very extensive study. This one you can download because I don't have time to explain, but there's no significant that the recommended immunization schedule is not safe. In other words, it's safe. And another review in 2014 that supports the immunization period. Now, this is probably my last topic. May I just continue? The cold chain is very critical, because it's been shown that most heat-sensitive vaccines must be kept between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius at every given point. And if you don't, there's a loss of potency, which, if repeated, becomes cumulative and could lead to vaccine failure. I would urge you to take a look at this CDC guideline because it's a very clearly written piece of, which is evidence-based, because they have studied also the equipment. And look at this. They say, do not store any vaccine in a dormitory style or bar style, etc. I don't know if we are using that still. It's worthy, I think, of your consideration. And so the DOH still follows the EPI, but of course we know there are a lot of work to keep in order to keep our mass immunization safe, because it's a challenge for any country having to immunize so many people. So these are the key. You have to know the target disease. Is there really a need for the vaccine? You have to know the vaccine and the expected AEFIs in the table I showed you, so you're prepared for any emergencies. You have to know your recipients, the vaccinees. You have to make sure that they know where to go in case there's a problem. And you have to know the site. Be sure that you have enough room. You have room for treatment and other emergencies that are needed, and communicate. And as a last slide, these are the future work that's ahead. Number one, we have to strengthen our AEFI surveillance reporting and assessment. Maybe we need to have a consortium of private and DOH hospitals to link us as sentinel surveillance centers and serve as large database, no, to detect rare AFIs in our population. And perhaps our universities should open their eyes to opening courses in vaccinology. And also, because of the fear of litigation, which is what happened to the US a long time, not so long time ago, when practically all the manufacturers wanted to close shop because of litigation. They put out this national compensation for the National Vaccine Injury Act, which will compensate those who have suffered from AEFIs. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that very comprehensive lecture, Dr. Lazo, on monitoring vaccine safety.